January 31st, 1982, Moscow, 11:47 a.m. The winter sky above the Kremlin hung like hammered steel, cold, grey, unyielding. Snow fell in thin curtains across Red Square, muffling the footsteps of bundled citizens hurrying past Lenin's tomb. In the bowels of the Soviet Air Defense Forces Command Center, buried 3 stories beneath Frunzenskaya embankment, Colonel Dmitry Kozlov sat before a wall of radar screens, their green phosphorescent glow painting his face in ghostly relief. The air smelled of burnt coffee, cigarette smoke, and machine oil, the perfume of Cold War vigilance. Then, without warning, a blip appeared on the edge of his scope, traveling west to east. Speed, Mach 3.2. Altitude, 85,000 feet. Kozlov's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. His pulse quickened. For a moment he wondered if the equipment had malfunctioned, if some solar flare had corrupted the signal. But no, the signature was unmistakable, clear, impossible, and moving directly toward the heart of the Soviet Union. "Contact," he whispered, though his voice barely carried over the hum of refrigeration units cooling the radar banks. Within seconds, alarm klaxons began their mechanical howl. Officers scrambled to their stations. Telephones rang in cascading waves, and somewhere far above, slicing through the stratosphere like a dart thrown by gods, an American SR-71 Blackbird was doing what Soviet generals had sworn could never be done. It was flying over Moscow itself, untouchable, invisible to interceptors, a shadow cast by American technological supremacy across the very seat of Soviet power. This was not supposed to happen, not here, not ever. To understand the horror that seized Soviet air defense that winter morning, one must first understand what the SR-71 represented, not merely as an aircraft, but as a symbol of everything the Soviet Union feared and envied about American capability. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was not simply fast. It was a technological marvel so far ahead of its time that even today, decades after its retirement, no manned aircraft has exceeded its performance. Designed in the late 1950s by Clarence Kelly Johnson and his Skunk Works team in Burbank, California, the Blackbird could cruise at speeds exceeding 2,200 miles per hour, more than 3 times the speed of sound. It could fly at altitudes above 85,000 feet, where the sky fades to black and the curve of the Earth becomes visible. At such heights, pilots wore pressure suits identical to those worn by astronauts. They were not merely aviators, they were operating at the edge of space itself. But speed and altitude were only part of the equation. The SR-71's titanium skin, specially designed to withstand the 600-degree heat generated by friction at Mach 3, was treated with radar-absorbent materials that reduced its detectability. Its engines, Pratt & Whitney J58 turbojets with afterburners, operated on a unique fuel mixture so volatile it required a chemical ignition system just to start. The aircraft leaked fuel on the ground because its panels were designed to expand and seal only at high temperature. Everything about the Blackbird defied conventional logic. It was a machine built not to dominate the battlefield, but to render the battlefield irrelevant through sheer speed and altitude. No missile could catch it, no fighter could intercept it. It existed in a realm beyond reach. For the Soviet Union, which had spent decades pouring resources into surface-to-air missile systems, radar networks, and interceptor squadrons, the SR-71 was a nightmare made tangible. The entire architecture of Soviet air defense, the S-75 Dvina missiles that had shot down Gary Power's U-2 in 1960, the MiG-25 Foxbat interceptors specifically designed to counter high-altitude threats, the layered radar installations stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, all of it was rendered obsolete by an aircraft that simply flew too high and too fast to touch. And the Americans knew it. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, SR-71s conducted reconnaissance missions along the Soviet periphery, skirting borders, photographing naval installations, monitoring missile tests. These flights were provocations, carefully calibrated to remain within international airspace while demonstrating American reach. Soviet commanders watched their radar screens with impotent fury as the Blackbirds appeared and vanished like ghosts, always just beyond range, always untouchable. But flying along the border was one thing. Flying directly over Moscow, over the Kremlin itself, over the nerve center of Soviet power, that was something else entirely. That was a violation so profound, so brazen, that it struck at the very heart of Soviet pride and security doctrine. The men stationed in the Soviet air defense command centers during the Cold War were not ordinary soldiers. They were the elite, officers selected for intelligence, technical proficiency, and ideological reliability. Many had trained for years, studying Western aircraft capabilities, learning to distinguish between radar signatures, memorizing threat matrices and intercept protocols. They understood, in abstract terms, that American reconnaissance aircraft were superior. But understanding and experiencing are different things. And on that January morning in 1982, when Colonel Kozlov and his team watched the SR-71's radar signature slice across their screens, theory became visceral reality. What they expected was a border flight, routine, predictable, manageable. What they experienced was humiliation. The blip moved with such speed that by the time one radar station confirmed the contact, the aircraft had already passed into the coverage zone of the next station. Altitude readings fluctuated wildly as the Blackbird's electronic countermeasures spoofed tracking systems. Communications channels flooded with conflicting reports. Fighter scrambles were attempted. MiG-25s launched from Domodedovo and Kubinka airbases, their pilots pushing throttles to maximum thrust, climbing desperately toward the stratosphere. But the SR-71 was already gone, already beyond Moscow, already crossing into Ukrainian airspace before the interceptors even reached their operational ceiling. One pilot, Captain Viktor Belenko, would later describe the experience in a debriefing that remained classified for over a decade. "We were told to intercept a high-speed target. We climbed as fast as the aircraft allowed. At 80,000 feet, I was at maximum altitude. My instruments showed the target above me, ahead of me, moving away. It was like chasing a meteor. We had no chance, none, and we knew it. The Americans wanted us to know it." The psychological impact cannot be overstated. These were men who had been trained to believe in Soviet technological parity, who had been told that the motherland's defenses were impregnable, that no enemy could violate Soviet airspace with impunity. Yet here was an American aircraft doing exactly that, not through stealth or subterfuge, but through raw, overwhelming performance. It was a demonstration of power more demoralizing than any propaganda broadcast. It said, without words, "We can go anywhere, we can see anything, and you cannot stop us." The historical record surrounding specific SR-71 overflights of Moscow remains partially classified, wrapped in layers of secrecy and Cold War ambiguity. The United States Air Force officially maintained that SR-71 missions adhered strictly to international law and did not deliberately violate Soviet airspace. Yet former pilots, intelligence officers, and Soviet defectors have spoken, sometimes in oblique terms, sometimes with surprising candor, about missions that pushed boundaries, tested responses, and occasionally crossed lines that existed more in diplomatic fiction than operational reality. Colonel Richard Graham, an SR-71 pilot who flew dozens of operational missions, once remarked in an interview years after retirement, "There were times when we flew very close to places we probably shouldn't have been. The aircraft's capabilities allowed for flexibility. If a mission required us to see something, to photograph something, we had the means to do it. Whether we were technically over the border or just near it, those were questions for people above my pay grade." Soviet military archives, declassified in the 1990s, reveal a pattern of panic surrounding high-speed, high-altitude intrusions during the early 1980s. Reports filed by air defense commanders describe unidentified targets moving at speeds and altitudes consistent with the SR-71, targets that appeared over sensitive installations, nuclear facilities, ICBM bases, military research centers, and vanished before effective countermeasures could be deployed. In several instances, missile batteries fired SAMs in desperation, launching volleys of S-200 and S-300 missiles at targets far beyond their effective range. Every missile fell short, every intercept failed, and with each failure, the psychological toll mounted. One declassified memo from General Ivan Tretyak, commander of Soviet Air Defense Forces, dated February 1982, contains a stark admission. Current systems are inadequate to counter the American SR-71 reconnaissance aircraft. Despite repeated attempts to intercept, all efforts have failed. The aircraft operates with impunity at altitudes and speeds our technology cannot match. Immediate development of advanced systems is required, but projected timelines extend beyond 1990. Until then, we remain vulnerable to overflight and surveillance. This vulnerability was not merely technical, it was existential. The Soviet Union's entire strategic posture rested on the assumption of defensive capability, on the ability to deny enemies access to Soviet territory and information. The SR-71 shattered that assumption. It revealed that despite decades of investment, despite the thousands of missiles and radar stations and interceptors, the Soviet Union could not protect its own airspace from a single American aircraft. And if they could not stop one reconnaissance plane, what else could they not stop? The Blackbird's invulnerability rested on a trinity of design features: speed, altitude, and heat resistance. But embedded within that trinity was something more fundamental, a philosophy of aerospace engineering that reflected deeper American attitudes toward technology and problem-solving. Where Soviet designers favored brute force and numerical superiority, American engineers pursued elegance and performance margins. The SR-71 was not built to win dogfights or carry bombs. It was built to render conflict irrelevant by operating in a domain where conflict could not occur. Consider the fuel. JP-7, a specialized blend developed specifically for the J-58 engines, had such a high flash point that ground crews could extinguish a lit match by dropping it into a bucket of the stuff. Yet at operational temperature, under the immense heat generated by sustained Mach 3 flight, that same fuel became a coolant, circulating through the aircraft's skin to prevent structural failure. The fuel tanks, initially leaky on the ground, sealed perfectly at altitude as thermal expansion closed microscopic gaps. The aircraft literally transformed itself during flight, becoming what it needed to be only when pushed to its operational limits. Or consider the camera systems. The SR-71 carried optical cameras with resolution so acute they could photograph a golf ball from 80,000 feet. Film magazines held thousands of feet of specially formulated film that could withstand the temperature extremes and capture images through windows made of fused silica quartz. Intelligence analysts could examine photos taken over Soviet territory and identify individual vehicle types, read unit insignias, track construction progress on military facilities. The level of detail was staggering, and the Soviets knew, because their own intelligence sources told them, that American satellites and reconnaissance aircraft maintained near-continuous surveillance of their most sensitive sites. This knowledge bred paranoia. Soviet military planners had to assume that any movement, any deployment, any test or exercise could be observed and analyzed. Operational security became an obsession bordering on pathology. Yet, despite elaborate camouflage efforts, despite building entire dummy facilities to deceive overhead reconnaissance, the Americans always seemed to know. Because the SR-71 and its satellite counterparts provided an omniscient eye, a view from heights where Soviet power could not reach. But the Blackbird's greatest weapon was not its cameras or its speed. It was the psychological effect it produced in those who watched it pass, untouched and untouchable. Throughout history, military technology has served dual purposes: the practical function of the weapon itself and the symbolic weight it carries in the minds of adversaries. Medieval knights wore armor not merely for protection, but to project invincibility. Battleships of the early 20th century were as much symbols of national prestige as instruments of naval warfare. The SR-71 functioned similarly. It was both tool and totem, both reconnaissance platform and psychological weapon. For the Soviet air defense officers tracking it, each appearance reinforced their impotence. They could see it, barely, on their screens. They could calculate its trajectory, predict its path, but they could not touch it. Orders would be issued, fighters would scramble, missiles would be readied, and then the blip would simply accelerate, climb higher, and vanish beyond the edge of radar coverage. The ritual became degrading. Like a cat watching a bird fly overhead, the Soviet air defense system could only observe its own limitations. This dynamic affected doctrine and strategy at the highest levels. In Politburo meetings throughout the early 1980s, defense expenditures dominated discussions. Billions of rubles were allocated to developing new missile systems, advanced interceptors, over-the-horizon radar networks, all in pursuit of a capability to counter the SR-71. The MiG-31, successor to the MiG-25, was designed with improved sensors and longer-range missiles specifically to threaten high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. New versions of the S-300 surface-to-air missile system were developed with enhanced altitude capabilities. Yet even as these systems entered service, American engineers were already conceptualizing the SR-71's successors: hypersonic vehicles, stealth aircraft, unmanned reconnaissance platforms that would push the technological frontier even further beyond Soviet reach. The arms race in this domain was not a race at all. It was a pursuit where one side remained perpetually ahead, and the other burned resources trying to close a gap that only widened with time. And the tragedy, if one can call it that from a historical distance, was that Soviet leaders understood this. Classified transcripts of Politburo meetings reveal a bitter awareness that the technological competition with America was unsustainable, that the Soviet economy could not support the level of investment required to match American aerospace capabilities, while simultaneously maintaining conventional forces, nuclear arsenals, and the vast apparatus of state control. Yet they had no choice but to try, because the alternative, acknowledging inferiority, accepting vulnerability, was ideologically unthinkable. On the other side of this equation sat the men who flew the Blackbird. They were a small, elite group, never more than a few dozen pilots and reconnaissance systems officers qualified to operate the aircraft at any given time. They trained for years, learning to manage the physiological stress of high-altitude flight, memorizing emergency procedures, practicing the delicate ballet of aerial refueling that preceded every operational mission. They understood that they were flying a machine unlike any other, that survival depended on respecting its limits while exploiting its capabilities to their fullest extent. Major Brian Schull, one of the most celebrated SR-71 pilots, recounted a mission that exemplified the aircraft's dominance. Flying a routine reconnaissance mission along the Soviet border, his Blackbird was detected by air defense radar. Soviet fighters scrambled to intercept. Ground controllers transmitted warnings demanding the American aircraft leave the area. Schull's response was not defiance or evasion, it was acceleration. He pushed the throttles forward, watched the airspeed indicator climb through Mach 3, 3.1, 3.2. The Soviet fighters fell away, left behind as thoroughly as if they'd been standing still. "They had the will to intercept us," Schull later said. "They just didn't have the way." That distinction between will and capability defined the Cold War technological competition. Both superpowers possessed will in abundance. Both had pilots brave enough to push their aircraft to the edge of destruction. Both had scientists and engineers working in secret facilities to develop the next generation weapons and systems. But capability is not merely desire plus effort. It is the product of industrial capacity, educational systems, economic resources, and a culture of innovation that cannot be replicated through ideology alone. The United States in the 1960s, when the SR-71 was designed and built, had access to titanium markets, much of it, ironically, purchased from the Soviet Union through third-party countries under false pretenses, had aerospace firms competing for government contracts in ways that drove rapid innovation, had universities producing engineers trained in cutting-edge fields like materials science and thermodynamics. The Soviet Union had brilliant scientists and dedicated workers, but they operated within a command economy that prioritized political reliability over competence, that penalized failure so harshly that risk-taking became dangerous, that allocated resources through bureaucratic mechanisms rather than market efficiency. The structural differences produced divergent outcomes, and nowhere was that divergence more visible than in the realm of high-performance aerospace engineering. The symbolic weight of the SR-71, the idea of it, the myth surrounding it, grew with each mission, each near-miss intercept, each humiliating failure of Soviet air defenses. In the closed world of military intelligence, where information moves through classified channels and rumors, the Blackbird acquired an almost mythical status. Soviet pilots spoke of it in tones mixing respect and resentment. To have been assigned to intercept the SR-71 was to have been given an impossible task, a mission destined for failure from the outset. Yet the assignments kept coming, because doctrine required a response, because passivity in the face of violation was unacceptable, because the theatre of defense had to be maintained even when everyone involved knew the outcome. Consider the psychological burden placed on those MiG-25 pilots, scrambled again and again to chase an aircraft they could never catch. They were not cowards. They did not lack skill. They flew their interceptors to the ragged edge of performance, climbed until engines flamed out, maintained pursuit until fuel reserves forced them to turn back. And still they failed, every time, because the mission was impossible from the start. That kind of repeated failure, not through lack of effort but through lack of means, corrodes morale in ways that victories can never repair. One former Soviet interceptor pilot, who defected to the West in the mid-1980s, described the experience in an interview with Western intelligence. "We knew before we launched that we would not catch it, but we had to try. Orders were orders, so we climbed, we flew, we watched our radar screens as the target pulled away, and then we returned to base and filed our reports, and everyone pretended that next time would be different. But next time was never different. The Americans had built something we could not match, and flying against it taught us that lesson, again and again, until there was no room left for doubt." This educational process, this grinding, repetitive lesson in American technological superiority, had strategic consequences. It influenced Soviet military planning, shifted resource allocations, and contributed to a growing sense within Soviet leadership that the arms race, particularly in advanced aerospace technology, was unwinnable. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 and began implementing reforms that would eventually lead to the Soviet Union's dissolution, the economic exhaustion caused by military competition with the United States was a central factor. And while no single weapon system caused that exhaustion, aircraft like the SR-71 symbolized the depth of the technological gap and the futility of trying to close it through brute force spending. The SR-71's operational history is marked by missions that blurred the lines between reconnaissance and intimidation. In addition to flights along Soviet borders, Blackbirds conducted overflights of hostile territory during various Cold War crises. During the Yom Kippur War in 1973, SR-71s photographed the Suez Canal region, providing American policymakers with real-time intelligence on troop movements and combat operations. In the 1980s, missions over Central America monitored Soviet and Cuban military activities. Each time, the aircraft's presence sent a message: "We are watching. We know what you are doing, and you cannot stop us from knowing." But Moscow, overflying Moscow itself, represented something qualitatively different. It was not just reconnaissance, it was a statement of total air superiority, a demonstration that even the most heavily defended airspace on Earth could not prevent American penetration. Whether the January 1982 incident involved a direct overflight or a peripheral pass so close that Soviet radar interpreted it as a violation may never be fully declassified. What matters, historically, is that Soviet air defense officers believed it happened, reacted as if it happened, and filed reports indicating that their systems had been defeated by an American aircraft operating at will in their most sensitive airspace. The horror Colonel Kozlov felt that morning was not fear of immediate attack. He knew the SR-71 carried cameras, not bombs. It was the horror of obsolescence, of recognizing that the vast defense network he had spent his career maintaining was fundamentally inadequate. It was the horror of watching his nation's vulnerability displayed in stark, undeniable terms on a radar screen. And it was the horror of knowing that his superiors would demand explanations, would ask why the intercept failed, would want assurances that it would not happen again, assurances he could not honestly provide. In the years following the Cold War's end, as archives opened and veterans spoke more freely, the full scope of the SR-71's psychological impact became clearer. Former Soviet defense officials admitted that the aircraft had been a source of deep frustration, a constant reminder of American technical prowess. Some acknowledged that resources devoted to countering the SR-71, the advanced radar systems, the specialized interceptors, the research into high-altitude missiles, had drained funds from other military programs, contributing to the economic strain that weakened the Soviet state. American officials, for their part, recognized the dual role the Blackbird played. It was an intelligence-gathering platform, yes, but it was also a tool of strategic messaging. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force chief who championed the SR-71's development, once remarked, "The best weapon is one you never have to fire. If the enemy knows you can see him, knows you can reach him, knows he can't stop you, that's worth more than any bomb." The SR-71 was that weapon. It fired no shots, dropped no ordnance, engaged in no combat. Yet its mere existence, its routine missions along hostile borders, its occasional deep penetrations into contested airspace, shifted the strategic calculus of the Cold War. It rendered vast investments in air defense partially obsolete. It provided American policymakers with intelligence that shaped diplomatic negotiations and military planning, and it demoralized adversaries by demonstrating, day after day, that American technology operated in a realm beyond their reach. The story of the SR-71 is, ultimately, a story about the nature of power in the modern age. Traditional military might, armies, navies, masses of tanks and artillery, remained important, but the conflicts of the Cold War were decided as much by technology, economics, and information as by conventional force. The Blackbird embodied this shift. It was not a weapon of destruction, but a weapon of knowledge and psychological dominance. It succeeded not by killing enemies, but by rendering their defenses irrelevant, by operating in a domain where opposition was impossible. When Colonel Kozlov watched that radar blip cross his screen in January 1982, vanishing into the eastern sky before any effective response could be mounted, he was witnessing the future of conflict, a future where speed and altitude and technological sophistication mattered more than numbers or ideology. He was seeing, in real time, the obsolescence of his nation's defensive philosophy, and somewhere high above, beyond the reach of missiles and fighters, An American pilot in a pressure suit was taking photographs, collecting data, and preparing to return to base with intelligence that would be analyzed, disseminated, and used to maintain American strategic advantage. The Blackbird flew for over 3 decades, from 1964 to 1998, completing thousands of missions without a single loss to enemy action. Its retirement came not because adversaries had finally developed the means to counter it, but because satellite technology and unmanned platforms had evolved to the point where manned reconnaissance at extreme altitude was no longer necessary. The mission continued, only the platform changed, but the legacy remained. Today, when aerospace engineers design next-generation systems, hypersonic vehicles, stealth reconnaissance drones, spacecraft capable of operating at the edge of the atmosphere, they build on principles established by the SR-71. Speed as defense, altitude as sanctuary, technology as deterrent. These concepts, proven over hostile territory from the Arctic Circle to the Middle East, shaped not just aircraft design, but strategic thinking itself. And for those Soviet officers who watched the Blackbird pass, untouched and untouchable, the lesson was permanent and profound. Some gaps cannot be closed through determination alone. Some competitions are won not by those who try hardest, but by those who innovate fastest. And some aircraft, rare, exceptional machines born from the perfect convergence of engineering brilliance and national will, transcend their function to become symbols of an era, monuments to human capability, and reminders that in the contest of nations, the future often belongs to those who can see farthest, move fastest, and reach highest. The SR-71 vanished into history, retired to museums and memories. But the horror it inspired in those who tracked it, who scrambled to intercept it, who watched helplessly as it slipped through their most sophisticated defenses, that horror remains instructive. It teaches that security is not absolute, that invulnerability is an illusion, and that the only defense against technological superiority is not better walls, but better innovation. On a winter morning in 1982, over Moscow, an American aircraft demonstrated that truth with perfect, terrifying clarity. And the echo of that demonstration, the psychological tremor it sent through Soviet command structures, resonated long after the engine's roar had faded into silence and the snow had covered the runway tracks at distant American bases. The sky, it turned out, belonged to those who could reach it, and for 3 decades of Cold War, America reached higher than anyone else could follow.